So Paramount Plus have just released season 2 of the Fever Pitch documentaries. They're marketing this as the decade that changed football forever. And no, they're not talking about the birth of the Premier League in the 90s like they did in Series 1. This time, they're talking about the noughties.
2003 is the end of English football as we know it, and it's the birth of English football as a billionaire's game.
When I saw the advert for this new docu-series, it kind of got my back up a little bit, as I'm sure it did for most of you 90s fanatics. It got me doubting, was the 90s really the major decade of change in football, especially English football? Or is the new Fever Pitch series right? Was it in fact the noughties that changed football forever? Well, ladies and gents, in this video, we're going to make cases for both. So stick that thumbs up, subscribe for weekly 90s football content, and let's bloody do this. If you're a regular viewer on the channel, don't worry, we'll get on to part 2 of the Corinthian Collection series very soon. We're just waiting for a couple of the Euro 96 lads to turn up. They said they're just going for a few quiet drinks. But I'll tell you who did turn up, a gang of Gary McAllisters. 6 sealed in a box, never opened. I do love sealed blister box. So anyway, for those of you that haven't seen the docu-series, I think that's what you call them, I'm referencing today. I strongly advise you do so. It's a 2-part series though, so before you watch the most recent one, watch the one that came out a couple of years ago. The one that came out a couple of years ago was called Fever Pitch, The Rise of the Premier League, and it's very much focused on the creation of the Premier League, the 90s and stuff, probably a little bit more down our lane, being the 90s nostalgia YouTube channel. But the more recent one is called Fever Pitch, The Battle of the Premier League, and obviously focus on the 2000s, the noughties. It's a big claim to say that the noughties was the decade that changed football, but if you saw the first series, they kind of hinted that maybe the 90s was the decade that changed football. So we're very much going to take that claim with a pinch of salt. Nonetheless, let's have a little look at some of the reasons the 90s might have changed football the most, or the reasons the noughties might have changed football the most. So let's get on with it. Now let's be honest, it's hard to not let nostalgia cloud our judgment. Obviously I'm a 90s kid, very much love my 90s football, so I'm going to be somewhat biased when I look back at the 90s. I've got the rose tinted glasses on. If you're watching this and you're in your 20s, obviously those rose tinted glasses will probably be more focused on your noughties childhood. If you're a bit older in your 40s, maybe it's the 80s and so on. But remember, this video today isn't about which decade was the best, it's about which decade changed football the most. In the new series, they use money from billionaire ownership, particularly Roman Abramovich, as the main factor for change in English football. Now, I'm not going to undermine the significance of this, but one could argue that this was just the next step in the evolution of the Premier League, off the back of everything that did happen in the 90s. I'm going to sound very old now, but the younger generation often bypass the Blackburn Rovers era of the Premier League. Now, Jack Walker's wealth was nowhere near the wealth of Roman Abramovich, but it was relative to the time, and Jack Walker did make some major moves in the transfer market.
I was actually flattered and hugely impressed that someone was prepared to pay that amount of money for me. Stupidly, maybe.
Alan Shearer playing at Blackburn Rovers, you know, everybody wants Alan Shearer. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone Man United, anywhere he wanted, he went there.
The major factor of me going to Blackburn was because one of the first things they said to me was, we want to win this Premier League and we want to win it sharpish.
Okay, so the names Blackburn bought were nowhere near as exotic as Crespo, Didier Drogba, Arjen Robben and Damien Duff. Instead, it was those no-nonsense British lads that helped Blackburn win the Premier League in the 94-95 season. 10 years prior to Man United having to splash the cash in order to compete with Roman Abramovich's Chelsea, they had to do the same with Blackburn. When they bought big names at the time, like Andy Cole the Goal.
Because that's what it became. We'll spend this, we'll spend this.
We were going into a different era of football with the Premier League, because that's when all the prices went up. It was like going from an Asda to a Waitrose, weren't it?
Now yes, I do agree that billionaire ownership has changed the game, and Jack Walker was by no means a billionaire. But it just shows money was entering the game long before the 2000s. In the new series, they mention the widening of the gap between top of the table and bottom of the table, and they use Chelsea and Southampton as an example. They highlight the huge differences in their spending in the transfer market, and for me it kind of highlights the start of the whole elite mentality. You know, you've got that big four, big five, big six, the us and them mentality. In order to compete with the big dogs, yes, in order to compete with the big dogs, ironically I've got a big dog, you had to spend money in the transfer market, otherwise there was no chance of you basically reaching the Premier League title. Obviously we had the exception that was Leicester City, and that's what made the Leicester story so nice, so much like, alright buddy. Warrior loved the Leicester story. It made the Leicester story so much better because Leicester went toe to toe with those big dogs and won. But very rarely will that happen again, if ever. Back in the 90s, that wasn't such the case. Obviously, teams spent more than others, but there very much was more of a level playing field. Everyone felt like they had a chance against the big boys, and yeah, there wasn't that elite mentality that became very relevant in the 2000s, due, of course, yes, to money. Disclaimer, he's alright, he's just a little bit vocal, especially with 90s football. Warrior loves 90s football and likes to voice his opinion. So if we look, for example, at Leeds United in the early 90s, well, the 89 to 90 season, they got promoted from the old second division into the first division, what would be now the Premier League. In their very first season in the top flight of English football, they finished 4th in the 90-91 season. Finishing 4th in your first year in essentially what was to become the Premier League is a fantastic achievement, but at the time didn't really seem like such a big thing. Anyone could do it. And then the following season, they went one step further. In the 91-92 pre-Premier League season, they won the bloody thing. They won the title. 2 years prior, they were in the league below. Like, that would just be impossible in this day and age. Maybe not impossible, I mentioned Leicester, but very much not happening, especially in the 2000s. So for me, that's probably the biggest argument as to why the noughties changed football forever. They gave the common everyday man, they took away his hopes and dreams of one day winning the title, because without money, without a billionaire owner, your team could no longer win the bloody Premier League. I mean, the first Premier League season, obviously they didn't go as far as Leeds, didn't actually won the thing, but Norwich were top of the table throughout most of the early stages of that 92-93 season. Obviously they bottled it towards the end, but who would have thought Norwich would be competing for the first ever Premier League? Just imagine if Norwich won the first ever Premier League. Maybe things would have been different after. Maybe the money wouldn't have entered quite as quickly as it did. Who knows? So yeah, the noughties did change football, but remember, change isn't always for the better. With that said, by the late 90s it was soon becoming clear that you had to spend money if you were to compete with Man United and Arsenal to win the title. Anyway, enough about money. I'm fed up of talking about money. For some of us, the quirky little changes, the little nuances that made 90s football so great, the change from the 80s to 90s, were weird, quirky little things, like all of a sudden players having their names on the back of their shirts. Maybe it was the fact that we got to sit down in a seat with our family to watch football as opposed to standing with a black eye. Maybe it was to do with the fact that football actually improved, the quality of football improved. Gone were the days of hungover blokes just hacking lumps out of each other on a muddy pitch. There were some flair players, but to me the standard definitely got better. Gone were the days of very little football on TV, now we had Sky Sports.
The multi-million-pound injection from Sky would have an immediate impact. The higher up the league table a side finished, the more money they'd get.
Good afternoon, everyone. A new league, you've got a different button to push on your television set.
In the 90s, we started having PlayStation games. We got to play FIFA. And basically, we just all got completely merched out. We started buying shirts, we started buying hats, we started buying stickers. We did that before the 90s, but you know what I mean. Basically, started buying all kinds of tat. So yeah, I've kind of defeated my point. Basically, everything does have a link to money. Let us know in the comments below, peeps. What did you think was the decade that changed football the most? Was it the 90s? Was it the noughties? For me, I'm obviously going to be team 90s because this is Rise 90s nostalgia. But for me, the factors were that obviously money played a part in both. The level of money went up in the noughties, but it was new in the 90s. The 80s, prior to that, there was just no money in the game. The game was in a sorry state. And so much happened in the 90s that kind of made the noughties just a continuation of everything that happened in the 90s. Basically, we've just spent the whole time talking about money, haven't we? Hope you've enjoyed the video, guys. Stick that thumbs up if you did. Remember, I upload every Sunday on the channel, so we've got weekly 90s football content. We're going to be doing probably a bonus episode in the week for part 2 of the old Corinthian collection. As you can see, a lot of these England figures. Our mission in part 2 of the Corinthian series is to complete the original batch of sort of the Euro 96 era of Corinthian figures. So if you like Corinthians, if you like anything 90s merch, collectibles, we obviously have got a thing for Corinthians at the moment. We're going to be doing like Merlin stickers, everything that we had as a 90s kid. So this is basically a horror story for my missus. Better keep the noise down so she doesn't hear, but it's fun for me. As you can see as well, if you're new to the channel, this is what used to be known as the shred shed during lockdown when I started training in my shed gym. Don't do a lot of training anymore, but we've renamed it. It's very much work in progress. As you can see, I've put some grass on the wall to make it look a bit like a football pitch. Why you'd have grass on the walls, I don't know, but this is now Rise 90s nostalgia. There we go. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.